Our tree farm is called the 100-Acre Woods, and that name came from grandchildren. They named it. About 156 or 7 acres, and it's located near Carnation, Washington. Well, in 1988, my daughter was out looking for some property, and the real estate man that she was talking to said, "How about you?" I said, "Oh, I'd like some woods and a stream or something like that." He said, "I know just the place for you." So we ended up buying the 76 acres along the roads. And then about 1998, I got a phone call from Trillium Timber Company. They owned the 40 acres in the middle here, and they were landlocked. And they wanted an easement for the road, so we made a deal on that. And they logged it, replanted it, then they wanted to sell it about a year later. So I was able to buy that. And then about 6 or 7 years ago, Abscon Timber Company bought 40 acres on top of the hill, and he wanted to use the road, and we made a deal on that, and he extended it up the hill. Then a year later, he wanted to sell that, and so we were able to buy that one.
Well, we've got 157 acres, primarily Douglas fir. We've got cedar, hemlock, alder, lots of alder. Cottonwood. We've got 77 acres that has second growth, so there's some nice big logs on that. And this here in the middle 40, they're about 22 years old. And then the upper 40 was logged and replanted about 7 years ago, and they're probably 20 feet tall now and looking real happy. The middle 40, we're going to do a pre-commercial thin here next month.
So the forest management plan we put into place in 2015, and that was with the assistance of Wazoo Forest Extension Program in their coached planning. And that plan, it was a lot of fun to do. We covered all of the different areas that a plan requires as far as keeping the trees healthy, managing the forest, and we've got our timeline set out as well as far as what we want to do over the next 20 years.
We've got a spring-fed wetland. It's a registered wetland, and there used to be a beaver complex, but the beaver have since gone. Now there's not much water left in it, but when my father originally bought the lower 77, we had a boat in the pond.
I got lots of wildlife cameras, yep. We keep them up all year just to kind of see how the animals are doing, see the population of deer and elk. Well, we have black bears too. We have a sow with 2 cubs. She just had them this year, so two little baby cubs. Pretty cool to watch them grow up. You got an amazing ecosystem out here. We have cougars, bobcats, coyotes, all sorts of birds, I mean ducks, geese, all sorts of critters out here. Some
of the challenges have been the prolific cottonwood and alder choking out a lot of the firs that were planted, and especially in the upper 40. They kind of took over right after the initial replanting, and we had it sprayed and replanted another 5,000 trees. And after the spraying, they've gotten their heads up and they're looking pretty happy up there. Some of the other challenges we've had is pockets of root rot, which we've addressed and taken out the trees in that area and replaced them with mostly pine and cedar, something that's root rot resistant. And other than that, it's a lot of fun out here.
I love hard work, so it's great to be out here. But mostly what I really enjoy is the opportunity to spend a lot of quality time with family and to gather. And it's just such an honor to be part of a project like this where you're managing the forest and you're kind of retaining a piece of the land in its natural state, and that's why we call it a little slice of heaven out here. The family's legacy plans for the tree farm is to keep it just as it is. We want to see this continue for generations to come so everybody can enjoy it like we've been enjoying it all these years now.